My wife and I had been together for a meaningful and deeply connected 4 years, every one of them spent as husband and wife. From the outside, and even to me for the longest time, it seemed like we had a solid foundation, a partnership built on love, mutual respect, and shared dreams. We weren't just coasting through marriage, we were actively planning for our future. We talked constantly about what our life together would look like, where we'd live, what our careers would become, and most importantly, the family we'd raise. From early on, having children was at the center of those conversations. She used to light up whenever the topic came up. She'd often talk about wanting 2, or maybe even 3 kids. We'd spend late evenings curled up on the couch, throwing around baby names like we were already preparing to meet them. She'd describe the nursery she imagined: soft colors, cozy furniture, twinkling lights, and she'd show me baby clothes online, already picking out outfits she wanted to buy. It was one of our special rituals, this vision of our future, and it brought us closer together in a way nothing else really did. So naturally, once we were married, it felt like the next step was to make those dreams a reality. We were excited and more than ready to start trying. Everything seemed to be lining up perfectly. But sometimes, life throws you a curveball that you never saw coming, something that shakes the ground you're standing on. After a few months of trying and seeing no results, we decided it was time to talk to a doctor. We wanted answers, hoping maybe it was just timing or stress. What we got instead was a diagnosis that flipped our entire world upside down. The issue, it turned out, was with me. My sperm count was abnormally low, so low in fact that the doctor said our chances of conceiving naturally were incredibly slim, nearly non-existent. Hearing those words was like being sucker punched by fate. I felt hollow inside, like all those dreams we'd built together had just evaporated in a single sentence. I carried that weight hard, the guilt, the shame, the feeling that I'd failed, not just as a husband but as a man. I spiraled for a while, emotionally and mentally. It took months of therapy and self-reflection to pull myself out of that dark place, and even then it left scars. She was there in the beginning, saying all the right things. She told me it didn't matter, that we were enough for each other, that she'd be happy with just the 2 of us. But something about the way she said it never sat quite right with me. It was too easy, too quick a shift from the woman who used to obsess over baby shoes and onesies to someone now saying she didn't need that life at all. It was like she was trying to convince herself as much as she was trying to comfort me. As time passed, I noticed subtle changes. The excitement that used to light up her face when we talked about the future was gone. She no longer brought up kids, not even in passing. And there was this strange undercurrent in our day-to-day life. She became more critical, more distant. Suddenly she'd make little remarks about my appearance or how I wasn't doing enough around the house. Maybe I had gained some weight, maybe I wasn't as sharp as I used to be, but the timing and tone of those comments felt cruel. When I asked her directly about what had changed, she'd wave it off. "You're being sensitive," she'd say, or "You're reading too much into things." But I wasn't imagining it. I knew her, or at least, I thought I did. The woman who used to laugh with me until midnight now barely looks me in the eye. She wasn't mean, not exactly, but her warmth had faded. There was this emotional distance, like her body was still here, but her mind had packed its bags and moved on. Still, I tried to make things work. I stopped pushing, stopped asking too many questions. I didn't want to come across as insecure or needy. I figured maybe it was just a rough patch, something we'd work through eventually. We settled into a routine, comfortable but hollow. We talked about the weather, groceries, and bills, but never about dreams, never about family. I tried bringing up other possibilities, adoption, surrogacy, but each time she shot it down without hesitation. "I just want to focus on us," she'd say. "Isn't that enough?" But it never felt like she believed her own words. It was like she was trying to escape the conversation, not the reality. And then came the trip. She mentioned it casually, said she wanted to take a girls' trip with her friends. It wasn't unheard of, she'd done it before. Nothing ever seemed suspicious. We lived in Brighton, and she said she was flying to America for a week-long getaway with her closest friends. She even named people I knew. It sounded fun, and I was happy she was doing something for herself. I helped her pack, folded her favorite outfits into her suitcase, and made sure she had everything she needed. I even drove her to the airport. She hugged me before walking through the terminal doors, and with a strange softness in her voice, she looked back and said, "Thank you for being so supportive." It struck me as odd. I mean, that's what partners do, right? It wasn't like I'd gone above and beyond, but I chalked it up to her being sentimental. That night, I stayed up. Her flight was about 9 hours, and I planned to check in once she landed. I kept an eye on the flight tracker, watching it move across the map until it finally touched down. I called her, expecting to hear about her hotel or how the flight had gone, but the call rang and rang. No answer. I figured maybe she was exhausted or her phone had died. Still, something in my gut didn't feel right. I waited until morning. No call, no text, just silence. I tried again. Still nothing. Sent a few texts. Tried to stay calm. Maybe she was out sightseeing. Maybe she forgot to charge her phone. But the longer I waited, the heavier the dread sat in my stomach, like something was unraveling right before my eyes. After several more agonizing hours with no word from her, I couldn't take the silence any longer. At first I kept trying to convince myself that she was just caught up in travel logistics, or maybe she was having technical issues with her phone. But my worry had evolved into full-blown panic. I picked up the phone and called her sister, hoping she might have heard from her or had some explanation. But she hadn't received a single text, not a call, nothing. That's when my heart started pounding in a way that was more fear than concerned. Desperation led me to contact her close friends, the very ones she claimed were going on the trip with her. Maybe they knew something I didn't. Maybe she had met up with them and just forgot to check in. My voice trembled as I dialed, trying to mask my rising dread. When I got through to one of them, her confusion was immediate and genuine. "What trip?" she asked. "We're not in America. We're actually just 2 blocks away at a cafe." That moment shattered whatever denial I was still clinging to. She wasn't with them. She hadn't flown overseas for a fun getaway. The truth hit me like a freight train. She had lied. She hadn't gone on any girls' trip. She hadn't traveled with friends. She hadn't even stayed in the same city under some cover story. She was simply gone. I stood frozen, clutching the phone like it was the last thread connecting me to some version of reality. My legs went weak. I collapsed into the nearest chair and just sat there, trying to make sense of the betrayal. Every detail of the past few days, her strange tone at the airport, the thank you for being so supportive, the overly sweet smile, all of it replayed in my mind with chilling clarity. She had orchestrated the whole thing, lied to my face, and disappeared. My brain couldn't process it. Why would she do this? Why deceive me instead of just talking to me? Why stage a trip instead of being honest? I clung to implausible excuses. Maybe she missed a flight. Maybe something happened and she couldn't call. But those were desperate thoughts, grasping at smoke. Deep down, I knew this wasn't an accident. She had planned this escape. The shock warped into disbelief, then dread. My wife, the woman who used to fall asleep beside me, talking about our future, was now a stranger. The woman I shared everything with had vanished behind a web of lies. It all began to add up. The emotional detachment, the sharp remarks, her disinterest in fixing things. She'd been detaching, piece by piece, slipping away while I told myself everything was fine. That night, I didn't sleep. I just sat there with my phone clutched in my hand, watching the screen like it might suddenly light up with her name. I would have taken anything, a text, a voicemail, even a wrong number, just something to remind me I wasn't completely invisible to her. But nothing came. And some part of me already knew it wouldn't. When morning came, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, unable to move. Her side of the bed was cold, untouched. Reality had settled in like a heavy fog. She was gone, and not in some accidental or temporary way. She had packed her things, crafted a story, and vanished. Everything I had told myself the night before, about her being delayed or needing space, fell apart under the weight of the truth. She didn't want to be found. The first few days after her disappearance felt like a waking nightmare. I called her phone countless times, clinging to hope that she'd finally pick up, that I'd hear her voice, and she'd offer some explanation. Most times, I didn't even know what I was going to say. I'd leave voicemails with trembling words and confused questions. But there was never a response. Her silence screamed louder than any goodbye ever could. I started visiting her family, mostly her mother, who was just as blindsided as I was. She hadn't heard from her either and had no idea about the trip. Her confusion seemed genuine, and I could see she felt for me. She didn't have answers, but she offered me kindness when I needed it most. Some nights, I'd crash on her couch, because I couldn't bear going home to an empty apartment. She'd make me food I barely touch, and sit quietly while I tried to process everything out loud. There were times when all I could do was sit with my hands in my lap, too numb to speak. I would replay every memory, every conversation, hoping I'd missed something obvious that would make sense of it all. I started questioning myself constantly. Had I failed her somehow? Had I missed the signs she was unhappy? Was I too wrapped up in grieving our infertility that I didn't notice her slipping away? The mental loops were endless. I examined every argument, every tender moment, every subtle shift in her mood. I racked my brain for clues, convinced that if I could just pinpoint the exact moment it all went wrong, maybe I could undo it somehow. I know it sounds obsessive, and it was. I barely ate. Sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford. My job performance plummeted. Colleagues asked if I was okay, and I gave them the same canned answer, just dealing with some stuff. Eventually, I told a few close friends the truth. They tried to help in their own ways, taking me out, making me laugh, trying to distract me. I appreciated their efforts, but even in the middle of a crowded pub or a movie night, my mind was always somewhere else. I couldn't stop thinking about her, wondering where she was, what she was doing, and why she'd decided I wasn't worth staying for. The hardest part was the people who didn't know. Neighbors, acquaintances, old co-workers. They'd smile and ask, "So, how's married life?" Or, "What's your wife up to these days?" Every time it was like taking a knife to a wound that hadn't even begun to heal. I couldn't bring myself to tell them the truth, so I'd lie. I'd smile and say, "She's good," while feeling like a fraud. That constant pretending drained whatever energy I had left. Eventually, I reached a breaking point. I realized I couldn't go on like that, pretending everything was okay, obsessing over things I couldn't change, feeling hollow every second of the day. So I made a choice that would finally help me start climbing out of the hole I'd been buried in. I found a therapist. I'd never considered therapy before, but the moment I walked into that room and sat across from someone who had no connection to me or her, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Relief. For the first time, I could speak freely without worrying about judgment or pity. Week by week, I unpacked the chaos. The betrayal, the confusion, the loss of someone I thought I knew. It didn't fix everything overnight, but it gave me a foundation, a place to start again. Week after week, I sat on that therapist's couch pouring out every emotion that had been festering inside me, the betrayal that cut deeper than any physical wound, the overwhelming rage that surged when I thought about how easily she walked away, and the hollow emptiness she left behind like a crater in the middle of my life. I talked about the nights I couldn't sleep, about lying awake, staring at the ceiling as my mind spiraled through every memory, every word she'd ever said. I replayed those final days in a constant loop, trying to pinpoint the exact moment everything unraveled. What I didn't expect was how much clarity those sessions would eventually bring. My therapist didn't offer magical solutions or quick fixes. What they did offer was perspective, something I hadn't had since she disappeared. They helped me see that no matter how much I obsessed, there wasn't a single moment or action that would have kept her from leaving. That decision was hers, and hers alone. And while that realization hurt more than I could articulate, it was also a turning point. I'd spent so long thinking I had failed her in some profound way, but slowly, I began to see the cracks that had been forming long before the collapse. She had been emotionally absent for months, if not years. The cold shoulder, the passive jabs about my appearance or productivity, those weren't isolated incidents. They were warning signs, and I'd ignored them. I'd clung to the belief that if I just worked harder, if I loved her enough, that would be enough to keep our marriage intact. But a relationship can't survive on one person's effort alone. That was a hard truth to swallow. Once I stopped blaming myself for her decision, I began taking small, hesitant steps toward rebuilding the person I used to be. It felt strange at first. I had invested so much of myself into our relationship that I didn't quite know who I was without it. I was always the one making sure everything at home ran smoothly, always trying to make her happy, always putting her needs ahead of my own. But now, I had all this time and space, and I had no idea what to do with it. So I started by picking up old hobbies that I'd abandoned somewhere along the way. I returned to the gym, slowly rebuilding strength not just physically, but mentally. I pulled out the stack of books I'd meant to read for years and actually started turning pages again. I even experimented in the kitchen, trying out new recipes just for the sake of it. These small, seemingly trivial things gave me moments of peace and helped me reclaim parts of myself that had gone dormant. Work, too, started to improve. At first, I was merely going through the motions, doing just enough to get by. But as I began feeling more like myself, I threw myself into it with renewed focus. The structure gave me purpose, and that discipline translated into results. My bosses noticed. I received a promotion, something I never would have achieved if I'd still been lost in self-pity. That recognition felt like validation, a tangible reminder that I was capable, valuable, and resilient. Of course, not every day was easy. Grief doesn't disappear just because you're busy. Sometimes, I'd stumble across old photos, receipts from a night out, or a souvenir from a trip we took together. Each one would stop me in my tracks, stirring up memories I thought I'd locked away. I'd wonder where she was, whether she ever looked back. whether she regretted her choices. But with time, those moments became less intense. I could put those memories aside more quickly. I could breathe again without feeling like the air was filled with ghosts. I also reconnected with friends I hadn't seen much since getting married. It surprised me how easily we fell back into old rhythms, golfing on weekends, hiking through trails I hadn't touched in years. Their laughter, their stories, and their presence reminded me that not every part of my world had collapsed. They weren't tied to my relationship with her, and that made it easier to be around them. They didn't pity me, they simply accepted me. Looking back, I realized I'd poured so much of myself into being a husband that I'd lost my own identity. When she left, it felt like she took a chunk of me with her. But as time passed, I slowly pieced myself back together. I was rediscovering the person I'd been before her, and even finding new parts I didn't know existed. It wasn't a straight path, it wasn't quick. But by the time that first year came to an end, I could look in the mirror and see someone I respected. I wasn't just the guy who got left. I was someone who had endured, who had rebuilt, who had grown stronger. For the first time in what felt like forever, I was living my life on my own terms. I wasn't haunted by what she did. I wasn't living under the weight of unanswered questions. I was healing. I was moving forward. And honestly, I was proud of that. Life wasn't perfect, but it felt stable. I had a rhythm again. Friends, work, peace of mind. I didn't wake up thinking about her. I didn't go to bed aching from the emptiness. The memories were still there, but they didn't control me anymore. So when there was a knock on my door one quiet Saturday morning, I had no reason to expect anything out of the ordinary. Maybe a delivery, maybe a neighbor. But when I opened the door, I froze. Standing there on my doorstep, like a ghost conjured from the past, was her. She stood there, holding a baby. My brain couldn't comprehend what I was seeing. It was as if the air had been sucked out of the room. She looked almost the same, maybe a little more tired, worn down by life, but unmistakably her. And in her arms, swaddled in a blanket, was a baby that couldn't have been more than a few months old. She looked up at me and smiled, like no time had passed, like she hadn't disappeared, like she hadn't shattered me. And that smile, that absurd, casual smile, hit me like a sledgehammer, because for a moment, I actually thought I was past caring. But seeing her again opened up a flood of emotions I'd buried deep beneath the surface. I couldn't speak. I just stood there, stunned, my heart pounding like a war drum. Then, without hesitation, she asked, "Can I come in?" The audacity. After all the deception, all the pain, all the silence, she just shows up? Like I'm supposed to welcome her with open arms, no questions asked? I kept my voice steady, my face unreadable. "No," I said. "You can stay right there and explain." I wasn't letting her back into the sanctuary I'd rebuilt. Not after all I'd been through. Not after clawing my way back from the wreckage. She looked surprised, thrown off by the calmness in my voice, but she stayed put, and then she began to speak. "I know this might be a shock," she said, glancing down at the baby, "but I wanted to come back and explain everything." She had this look, almost hopeful, like she genuinely believed I'd open my door, smile, and ask her to come in and sit down, like old times. As if years of silence, abandonment, and betrayal could be erased with one unannounced visit. I was caught between the absurdity of it all and a gnawing curiosity that kept me from slamming the door in her face. Part of me wanted to laugh outright. Another part wanted to close that door so fast the wind would blow her back off my porch. But curiosity held me there. I needed to know what justification she thought would make this okay. So I listened. She dove into her speech like she'd rehearsed it. She claimed she'd made a terrible mistake, that walking away had been the biggest regret of her life. Her words, not mine. She talked about how much time she'd spent reflecting, about sleepless nights filled with longing, about how becoming a mother had changed her perspective on everything. She said the baby in her arms was her wake-up call, the moment she truly understood what mattered in life. And apparently what really mattered to her was showing up at my door completely uninvited, years later, holding someone else's child, and talking about second chances like this was all just a minor hiccup in our love story. Then she looked down at the baby, her voice softening like she was presenting a gift, and said, "This is our second chance." I almost laughed, not because it was funny but because of how surreal it all felt. A second chance? Like this child, who wasn't mine, was supposed to act as some kind of magical reboot? A clean slate? She honestly believed that we could just pick up where we left off, as if the years of pain and silence had never happened. I kept my face as unreadable as I could, though inside I was boiling. I couldn't believe the level of audacity. She rambled on about rebuilding our family, how she'd seen the light, how she missed me, how now we could be whole, just the three of us. A fresh start, a do-overs. I had to hear it straight from her. I had to ask the question that had haunted me every night since she vanished. Where would you leave? I kept my voice calm, even, but it took everything in me not to let the anger bleed through. Years of silence, of self-blame, of unanswered questions, all waiting for this one moment. I deserved the truth. She faltered, her eyes dropped to the ground, her fingers tightened around the baby's blanket. There was a long pause, maybe guilt, maybe hesitation, but finally she spoke. She said she left because she wanted a child, and since I couldn't give her one, she found someone who could. Just like that, cold, blunt, like she was explaining the weather, not like she was confessing to tearing my heart out and walking away without a second glance. And the worst part, she said it like it was just a logical decision, like she'd gone to the store and picked a different brand because the one she had was out of stock. No remorse, no sense of the destruction she left behind. Then she told me the man she left with didn't stick around, that he bailed, but by then she had the baby, and somewhere in that mess she realized she wanted me again. Wanted me back. Just like that. No apology could repair the damage, no explanation that could unmake the betrayal. She admitted to abandoning me, to having another man's child, and then expected me to say, "Welcome home," like nothing happened. I stared at her, trying to comprehend the arrogance. "So let me get this straight," I said. "You left, found someone else, had his baby, and now you think you can come back into my life and act like it never happened?" Her eyes welled with tears. She started crying, repeating that she was sorry, that she'd made the worst mistake of her life. She insisted I was the only one she truly loved, that she had been scared, confused, that the pressure to be a mother had clouded her judgment. She said fate brought her back to me. But nothing she said landed. It was like trying to patch a shattered window with tape. Every word sounded more desperate than the last. Her voice cracked as she spoke about how hard it had been doing this alone, how being a single mother wasn't what she'd expected. She actually had the nerve to try and guilt-trip me, painting herself as the victim, as if her hardship now erased the pain she inflicted then. She begged for support, said she wanted to make things work, that we could raise the child together, that I was strong enough, kind enough to understand. I just kept thinking, who does she think I am? I stood there letting her say her piece, but inside I had already made my decision. I was done. I looked her square in the eye and said, "You made your choice, and now you have to live with it. There's no second chance here." Her face twisted like the words physically hurt her, like she genuinely hadn't considered the possibility that I might say no, as if her mere return should have been enough to wipe the slate clean. She tried again, more forceful this time, her tone sharper, less remorseful. She started accusing me of being selfish, cold, and unforgiving. She shouted that I owed her a chance to make things right, that she could have divorced me back then and taken half of everything if she'd wanted to. And then she pointed to the house, said it should still be hers, that I wouldn't even have it if not for her, that I was lucky she was giving me this opportunity. And in that moment it was like a mask came off. The desperation turned to entitlement, the sweet facade shattered, and I saw her clearly for the first time in years. Not the woman I loved, not my wife, just someone who had expected life to wait for her to come back. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I simply said, "You wanted something different and now you've got it. That's not my burden anymore." And then I shut the door. Her voice rose on the other side, muffled but unmistakable, pleading, shouting, knocking. I leaned against the door, eyes closed, and let the silence between us become final. The sense of calm that followed was overwhelming. For the first time in years, I felt free. I stepped away from the door, sat down, and realized how much lighter I felt. That chapter was over. I could hardly believe her nerve. There I was, standing in the only space that had become truly mine again, the one place I had painstakingly rebuilt after she left me in ruins. And yet, she had the audacity to stand on my front porch, demanding that I listen to her like she hadn't completely vanished from my life, like she hadn't tossed me aside like a broken toy. At first, I considered just letting her rant until her voice gave out. Maybe she'd scream herself hoarse, realize how ridiculous she sounded, and leave. But then, curiosity crept in. A morbid fascination, really. I wanted to know what new excuse she had come up with. What kind of self-serving logic would she spin this time to justify her betrayal? So I cracked the door. Just barely. Just enough for her to see I was there, listening, but not enough for her to step inside. That boundary was sacred now, and she wasn't crossing it. The look on her face was almost comical, like she'd been slapped. I think it genuinely stunned her that I hadn't welcomed her with open arms or launched into some emotional plea. She had probably rehearsed it all in her head, me, broken and desperate, grateful that she'd finally come back. Instead, she was met with a cold, unflinching stare and a door that remained mostly shut. That didn't stop her, though. She launched into another monologue, her voice almost theatrical. She said she was willing to forgive me for slamming the door on her earlier, as if she was doing me a favor. She said she was ready to move past our little spat, acting like she hadn't ghosted me for years, like this was just some minor relationship hiccup we could talk through over coffee. She spoke like we had argued about dishes or missed anniversaries, not about abandonment, betrayal, and complete emotional devastation. Then she started pushing the narrative that we could still make it work, that if we both put in a little effort, we could have something special again, that we could raise her child, someone else's child, together like a happy family. That's when I broke. I actually laughed. I couldn't help it. The sheer audacity was overwhelming. My laugh wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. It was more of a bewildered, exhausted exhale. The kind of laugh you let out when something is so absurd you can't even process it fully. Her face twisted the second she heard it. The fury behind her eyes was unmistakable. Like I had just disrespected royalty. Like I should be ashamed for not taking her performance seriously. I told her, plain and simple, you left. You had your chance and you threw it all away. I'm not just going to pretend none of that happened because you suddenly feel like it. Her cheeks flushed with rage. She snapped, accusing me of not understanding how hard it had been for her. She said she was lost, confused, that everything had spiraled out of control after she left. She painted herself as the tragic heroine of her own story. But I wasn't buying any of it. I reminded her that leaving was her choice, a fully calculated, premeditated decision. She lied about where she was going, lied to my face, and then she walked out of my life like it was nothing. Her regret now meant nothing. It was too late. That's when the mask slipped. The remorseful tone evaporated, her voice sharpened, and she began lashing out. She said I was being unfair, that I didn't even have the decency to give her a second chance, that I was heartless. Then came the threats. She said she could have taken everything from me back then, half my assets, the house, everything, that she had shown me mercy by not doing so. I stood there, speechless, not because I was afraid, but because I was stunned by how far she was willing to go to manipulate the situation. She was actually trying to frame herself as generous, like I owed her something for not destroying me completely when she left. So, I'm supposed to be grateful that you only abandoned me and didn't rob me on your way out? I asked. She didn't answer. Her expression flickered. Anger, then desperation, then maybe guilt, but I didn't care anymore. Whatever emotion she was faking, it didn't matter. The weight of guilt I'd carried for years lifted right then. All the nights I'd wondered what I'd done wrong. All the times I blamed myself. It all disappeared. I saw her clearly now. She wasn't the woman I had loved, not anymore. She was a stranger, one who had walked all over me and expected applause for her return. Still, she wasn't done. She began pacing back and forth on my porch like a storm gathering strength. She screamed about how I'd never find someone like her again. I'd regret this for the rest of my life. She actually believed I was the one losing out. She kept pushing, desperate to twist the narrative. Claimed I forced her to leave. If I had just been more understanding about the fertility issues, none of this would have happened. According to her, I had failed her as a husband because I couldn't give her a child, and that justified her betrayal. I was stunned by the sheer mental gymnastics. I told her, if having a child meant that much to you, you could have told me. You didn't have to lie and pretend like everything was fine while secretly planning your exit. She had no comeback, just silence. But I wasn't finished. You made that choice all by yourself, I said, and now you've got to live with it. That's not my burden. For a second I thought she might cry again, but then she played her last card. She held the baby up, her voice trembling, and said I was being unfair to him, that he deserved a father figure, that I was turning my back on an innocent child. It was manipulative, calculated. I looked her dead in the eye and said, I don't know that child. He's not mine, and neither are you. And that was it. I saw it in her face, the realization finally settling in. She knew there was no coming back from this, no redemption arc, no happy ending. Her eyes dropped. The anger gave way to something else, maybe real regret. Maybe just disappointment that she hadn't gotten what she wanted. But none of it mattered. She was just a stranger now. A stranger who thought she could waltz into my life, rewrite history, and pretend it was love. But I wasn't falling for it. Not anymore. She lingered there just outside my door for a few moments longer, like she was holding out hope that I'd change my mind at the last second. Maybe she thought I'd open the door again, call her back in a moment of weakness, or decide to forgive everything she'd done. But I didn't. I stood my ground, watching her expression shift slowly as reality settled in. Her eyes darted, searching mine, waiting for even the smallest crack in my resolve, but there wasn't one. And then, without saying another word, I shut the door. This time, I didn't wait around for more banging or shouting. I didn't hover nearby or brace for a scene. I knew, I felt, deep down, that I'd made my final decision. There would be no takebacks, no hesitation, no second guessing. For the first time since she walked out on me years ago, I felt a powerful sense of closure wash over me like a long overdue storm finally breaking. I walked away from the door not with regret or anger, but with a strange kind of triumph. I felt like I'd finally won. She'd spent so long believing she could just walk back into my life whenever it suited her, thinking she could manipulate her way into forgiveness, but it was done. That chapter was over. I was done carrying the weight of her choices on my shoulders. I was free. There wasn't going to be a second chance. Not for her, not for us. She was just a memory now. One I'd finally buried in the past, exactly where it belonged. All those years of torment, guilt, sleepless nights, endless wondering, they suddenly felt irrelevant. I could breathe again, and surprisingly, it felt good. The kind of good that fills your lungs in the early morning air after a long stormy night. When I shut that door on her, I didn't feel hate or bitterness. I felt peace. I wasn't sad. I wasn't angry. I was done. It was like every ounce of emotional energy I'd poured into that relationship over the years had finally been spent, leaving me clean, empty, and ready to be filled with something better. But of course, life rarely allows endings to be that clean. A few days later, I got a message from her mother. It was unexpected but not hostile. In fact, it was apologetic. She said she was sorry for how her daughter had handled everything, that she was ashamed of the choices that had been made, and that she had tried to talk sense into him, though clearly it hadn't worked. Her mom had always been kind to me, even after the split. She was there for me in ways her daughter never was, and I could tell her message came from a place of sincerity and pain. I didn't blame her. I couldn't, but I also knew better than to let myself be pulled back into that orbit, no matter how good the intentions might be. So I kept my response brief. "Thanks for checking in," I wrote. And that was it. No explanations, no rehashing, no openings. She understood. In the weeks that followed, I started hearing bits and pieces from mutual friends and through the grapevine of social media. Apparently she'd moved back in with her parents. Things weren't going well. The guy she'd left me for, the father of her child, was completely out of the picture. He'd taken off not long after the baby was born. No support, no involvement, just vanished. I guess fatherhood wasn't on his long-term agenda. Now she was stuck trying to figure it out alone. And it wasn't going smoothly. She'd burned so many bridges during her disappearance that she didn't have many people left to turn to. Most of the friends who'd sided with her in the beginning had moved on. They weren't interested in getting dragged back into her drama. I couldn't blame them. Her parents weren't thrilled either. They weren't in a position to support both her and a baby. I found that out firsthand not long after her mother's message. This time, it was her father calling. I hesitated before picking up. I almost let it go to voicemail, but curiosity got the better of me and I answered. He was polite but direct, said things had been tough. They were struggling financially and trying to help their daughter get back on her feet. And then came the pitch. He said, "We know you cared about her once," and started talking about the baby, about how hard life had been, about how she just needed a little help. I let him talk, but I already knew what I'd say. When he finally asked, without quite asking, if I might be willing to offer some kind of assistance, I gently but firmly shut it down. I told him I understood that times were hard, but his daughter's choices were her own, and her consequences weren't mine to carry. He didn't push after that. I think he got the message. But it didn't stop there. Soon after, old acquaintances started reaching out, people I hadn't heard from in years. A few played the guilt card, saying she was having a rough time, that she was trying to turn things around, that maybe I could find it in my heart to give her another chance. One of her friends even had the nerve to say, "That boy needs a father figure," and suggested I shouldn't let my bitterness prevent me from being a part of his life. Bitterness? They had no idea what I'd gone through, and more importantly, they had no right to suggest that healing and protecting my peace was bitterness. I stood my ground. I didn't owe anyone explanations. I'd spent years of my life trying to be enough for someone who didn't value me. I wasn't going to start that cycle over again. Not for guilt, not for obligation, not for anyone. Over time, the calls stopped, the texts dried up. It was like everyone finally realized I wasn't bluffing, that I wasn't playing hard to get, or being cold, or waiting for a dramatic reunion. I had truly moved on. And that's when peace finally arrived. Real peace. My life quieted, not in a lonely way, but in a comforting, steady rhythm. I had my routines again, my morning walks, my job, my circle of friends. I started enjoying things I'd overlooked during the chaos of marriage. I'd cook my meals, read books I'd been meaning to for years, even take weekend drives with no destination in mind. The simplicity was healing, the freedom was intoxicating. And most importantly, I didn't need anyone's permission to live this way. For the first time in what felt like forever, I was living life on my own terms. I wasn't constantly tiptoeing around someone else's moods, trying to read their mind or earn their approval. I wasn't shrinking myself to fit into someone else's expectations. I was just living. And that realization hit me in waves, small but powerful. I'd taken my life back, one slow piece at a time, and every day felt a little more like mine. Occasionally I'd bump into people who knew both of us. Former mutual friends, co-workers, neighbors. They'd look at me with curious eyes and ask the question they thought was harmless. Hey, whatever happened with her? And every time, I gave the same kind of response. Short, polite, detached. It didn't work out, or we went our separate ways. Then I'd shift the topic, not because I was ashamed or bitter, but because I simply didn't want to reopen a chapter I had already finished reading. She belonged to my past, and I had finally, fully learned how to leave her there. Last I heard, things weren't exactly smooth sailing for her. She was struggling to hold down a job, constantly bouncing between her parents' place and crashing on various friends' couches. It seemed like she had worn out her welcome in most places. Every once in a while, someone I barely spoke to anymore would send me a message, saying she was reaching out to anyone who would listen, asking for favors, help, or sympathy. A few of them even hinted that she was still holding out hope, that maybe, just maybe, I'd have a change of heart, that I'd come back, scoop her up, and step into the role of a father figure for her child. But that was never going to happen. I'd fought too hard, spent too much time and effort climbing out of that pit, to even think about jumping back in. I wasn't going to be the guy who swoops in and saves the day just because her backup plan fell through. I wasn't going to be her fallback, her safety net, her soft landing when the real world got too hard. That role had expired the moment she chose someone else over me. That chapter of my life, it was sealed shut, taped, boxed, and placed on a shelf I'd never revisit. And in the end, I got what I needed most, closure. She made her choices, now she lives with the consequences. And me, I got my freedom. Real, honest-to-goodness freedom. Not just from her, but from the guilt, the regret, the endless questions that haunted me for years. I no longer felt like I owed her anything, not an explanation, not my help, not my forgiveness. I wasn't looking for fireworks or fairy tales anymore. I didn't need dramatic declarations or grand revenge. What I found instead was something better. Peace. Simple, quiet, earned peace. And honestly, that was more than enough.